Welcome back to Business Week on Arise News. Low gas supplies and unpaid debts is how Nigeria's Minister of Power, Adebayo Adelabu, recently categorized his view of the two key issues besetting Nigeria's power sector. But that's not the whole story. Several regulatory and policy developments over the past year of the Tinubu administration have raised public expectation of more efficient power supplies, and these policies range from those enshrined in the Electricity Act around the decentralization of the market to the unbundling of the transmission company into two separate entities, including also recently the increase in tariffs for Band A consumers, as well as moves by the federal government to fund metering infrastructure around the country. But have these moves actually improved the state of our electricity sector? To help us answer these questions today, I'm joined by two experts. First, joining us virtually is lawyer and former Commissioner for Market Competition and Rates at NERC, Ekpo. Also with us in the studios in Lagos is engineer Jude Nwoko, MD CEO at Millwater Limited. He's an accomplished engineer whose firm Millwater is leading the provision of stable and reliable power across the country through plugging critical infrastructure gaps. Thanks for joining the show today, gentlemen. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Ekpo, joining us virtually. When all is said and done, consumers want to know, when are we going to get stable power supply? So what is your assessment of how well this administration has done in the past 12 months on the power sector?
Thank you, Rolake. Good morning to your viewers. It's a bit of comme ci, comme ça, here, this and that. It's a mixed bag. But I think I would score the administration as, first, being on the right path and trying to do the right things. I would take a number of markers. The first one is, for the first time, I think, in a very, very long time, we have an administration that is, first, being realistic about what can be done. We've heard in the past all sorts of numbers being thrown out, and then administrations being subject to the tyranny of those numbers, having to achieve 10, 20, whatever number of 1,000 megawatts. But when you look at that document, which was titled a draft, but which has now been accepted as being a work in progress, you will see in there an interesting number, which is 6,000 megawatts by the end of this year. I think that is realistic. And when you want to achieve, you have to start with honesty. And so if we are honest about where it is we are today, we recognize that a target of being able to hit 6,000 megawatts on the grid by the end of the year is very much achievable if we do the right thing. So that's one. The other thing that I would want to note is it's been 23 years since we had an electricity policy. In between 2001 and now, we've had each Minister of Power, each administration come in with a set of targets or priorities which are not necessarily agreed or accepted by either the country or the industry. We've had an Electricity Act, a new one that was passed. And in that act, two things I think are paramount. First, the obligation to reset our policy, which is a process which has started and is probably, I'd say, maybe 70, 80% of the way done. And the other is the fact that for the first time since 1979, we are recognizing that electricity is not entirely the federal government's business. The states are responsible for a significant element of delivering universal access, of delivering reliability, of delivering consistent supply. Indeed, it is the states that actually harbor the responsibility for distribution. And, you know, the power sector is like an aircraft carrier. You give an order to turn, it doesn't turn immediately. It probably travels for another 5, 6, 7 kilometers before it finally makes a turn completely. And that's what is happening. Okay. We're trying to make it turn in the right direction. So I would say those two things are markers that, for me, are extremely encouraging, and I would say steps in the right direction.
Thank you very much for outlining the government's efforts in that area. I mean, Mr. Nwoko, Mr. Ekpo talked about 6,000 megawatts, and the first thing that comes to my mind is infrastructure. How are we going to implement the right infrastructure network and framework to actually deliver that amount of electricity, and what is the private sector doing to aid that process?
Thank you very much, Rolake, and thank you for having me. And I'll just take it up from where our very respected colleague, my very respected colleague, has stopped. You know, this power sector got here. It's been a long journey, and untangling the knots will take quite a bit, right? Two key things he mentioned, and I would like to pick up of, is the obligation to resetting the policy. The government have shown that body language, that giving Nigerians the courage, the encouragement that they are postured to do something about, first, decentralizing the power that is concentrated at the federal level and giving responsibility to the state level. That in itself has given opportunities to private sector players like us, Mail Water Limited, to come into the play. I'll speak from my point of view from the project that we are dealing with. You know, the Tinubu-led administration, and well from the office of the Vice President, Shetima, has, because he sits at the board of NDPAC as the board chairman, has led an initiative we call it Light of Nigeria. The idea is to bring our stakeholders together and have private sector players like us who bring in the funding and the capital required, and then a measure of expertise to help unlock the bottlenecks within the sector. I feel that the posturing is right. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It will take a bit of, like Mr. Ekpo said, I love that analogy of the aircraft. The instructions have been given. The sector is a long spectrum. Consultations are on to see how these changes will play out at every level, from generation to the wheeling by TCN and to distribution asset infrastructure. In the distribution asset and infrastructure, that's where private players like us are encouraged to come in, bring in the requisite funding, the expertise, the knowledge, work with all the stakeholders, and fast-track these 5 miles that the aircraft may need to move before turning effective.
And what would you say to Nigerians who feel like they've heard this narrative before, right? We have a policy that's introduced. Yes, we acknowledge it takes a long time to implement, but we're still suffering on a day-to-day basis crippling shortages. So can you even tell us some good news, success stories, or projects that are actually making a difference?
Okay, so, you know, because I always speak from my point of view, right? The Office of the Vice President has flagged off the Light of Nigeria initiative, right? And personally, my colleagues and I, when we engaged the Vice President leading the team of the NDPAC, Niger Delta Power Holding, on the need to take these opportunities one cluster at a time. Now, Nigeria is a vast space. And if you look at this problem from the big picture, it looks daunting. But by the time you break them into micronucleus, you're able to deal with them one cluster at a time. So what we did was first begin to look at the industrial needs. And we zeroed in first with the help of the Lagos State government and our able partners in Ekpo Disco, which, I mean, I thank them for their forward-thinking leadership. We're able to come into a partnership to first unlock Agbara as a flagship of the Light of Nigeria project. We just had a groundbreaking last week. Now, the VP in posturing, because what people want to see is the body language and the effort first, and then it encourages private players like us to come in, bring in our resourcing, personnel, technology, because you know that there is a posturing from the top that shows that this initiative is not just paperwork. The government is ready to put their skin in the game. Right? On that said visit, we had a business roundtable conversation with the business community in Agbara. You'll be amazed, Rolake, if you take a trip to Agbara and see what's going on there. The first time I walked into a company like Strong Park, you know, and it was such, I felt I was in Singapore. You know, so
are these communities or companies actually getting power now, and how much will they be getting from these projects? So
the project is estimated to bring in at least 120 megawatts to the Agbara community, right? And because these are bulk consumers, a good number of them are self-generating. And you know they're not in the business of power, so you know the whole inefficiencies that will be associated with that. So grid power is always, the strategy is to unlock stranded grid power at the generation level, right? So people say we are underproducing for what our needs are, but you'll be shocked to know that part of what is being produced on a daily basis from the 8 or 6 functional plants of Niger Delta they're not able to evacuate up to 50%, 50% of it.
And you know, these are some of the issues we talk about. Mr. Ekpo, coming back to you, listening to the power minister some weeks ago at a conference talking about the gas shortages and the unpaid debts in the sector. We've heard about the infrastructure side of things. We've heard about the decentralization side of things, but there's still some legacy issues that plague the sector. So how do we actually tackle those legacy issues if we want to really advance the sector?
Okay, so I tend to see the underlying challenges of the sector as three-dimensional. Number one is just the fact that we haven't run the industry well in terms of governance. And when you don't govern well, both on the public sector and on the private sector side, you find out that you don't really have that much access to capital. So if you look at the last 10 years since privatization, most of the capital that has come into the industry has come from the government itself. And that's not the way it was designed. That's not the way it was meant to be. And that's simply because capital is very realistic and sensible, and it will not go to where you don't have the third issue, which is the discipline of payment. So if you look at what Mr. Nwoko has said, I think is the right strategy. I just for a second, just talk about that. You've got to address the big buyers first. I know it sounds elitist, but the truth of the matter is that unless you have a situation where energy is paid for on time, you will not have capital coming in to address the rest of us. And the best analogy I can probably make for this is what happened in the telecom sector maybe 20 years ago when they looked at first going to Lagos, then going to Abuja, then going to Port Harcourt before they came to my village or to your village, or before they decided to address actual mobile service along our highways. So there's a sense to the seeming disconnect, right? So when you look at those three things, governance, capital, adherence to contracts, and payments, you then ask yourself, so how do we then deal with what it is we have today, these legacy issues that you talked about? Again, I go back to that paper that was leaked. I don't know how it came out, but we've all seen this document that contains what you might call a Marshall Plan for the country. And to look at the power side of it, one element, the second element that I'd actually like to draw attention to is that part that talks about clearing away legacy liabilities. A lot of the liabilities, they have come about what we talk about, market shortfalls, tariff shortfalls, and they are largely created by one thing: the previous reluctance of the administrations in the past to let the economics of the sector speak for themselves, which will then drive us to efficiency. So when you have that, you have a government that says, no, we want to be paternalistic, we don't want people to pay, we'll subsidize tariffs for everybody rather than target those tariffs in a sensible manner. We'll just pay for everybody. You're going to have a shortfall. So the government wants to take off that shortfall. When you then take that away, you have a clean balance sheet for the sector, which means capital can then begin to come in. But I hope that the removal of those liabilities will also in tandem go with driving for discipline and efficiency in the way money is spent by the distribution companies. The generator companies, I think, have done pretty well for themselves. They are owed a lot of money, and on the back of that, they've also made investments. So I think our challenge is less with generation and more with reliability of the transmission grid, which itself tracks back to the fact that we have an insolvent distribution sector by and large.
Yeah.
So clearing that top level, when you have the underlying liabilities removed, then you have once again the opportunity for us to actually make the right investment decisions. And if you have that, then I would say that you can then begin to have drive for the discipline of being able to take one unit of energy and pay for it when it is due to be paid for, and not allow these liabilities to begin to creep up again.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mr. Nwoko, I want to ask you about what you think from a private sector perspective the real challenges are. I think Mr. Ekpo has quite eloquently outlined the issue around liquidity, debts, the balance sheet, ensuring you can attract capital. From where you sit, how can we attract more private capital into the power sector?
You know, what the tariffs that we have seen before were not cost reflective, right? Making the industry unattractive for investors. But with the gradual decentralization, we've opened up the market. And I don't want to go to the band A controversy, but you see, like my colleague mentioned, once these tariffs are cost reflective, you are able to pay along the lines for the gas, for everybody, even the distribution use of system charge, to the disco, the transmission use of system charge, to the transmission companies, everybody their own, the waterfall, everybody gets their own share, and the sector becomes more efficient and lean. But I want to re-echo his caution that when these initiatives are brought up, it is important that the stakeholders will put value first before any other interests.
What do you mean? Help us understand that a bit more.
So the value that drives us in Mail Water, for instance, is every average Nigerian deserves to flick on the lights and there will be power. Right? So everything we do in terms of our drive is to achieve that. For the Light Up Agbara initiative, for instance, our assurance to the community, the business community, and eventually the residential community is that with what we are doing right now to improve on the distribution infrastructure, strengthen the transmission infrastructure, invest in metering and fault technology, fault detection, will give them a guaranteed level of supply.
In which case they'll be willing to pay.
Is beyond the willingness, there is a signed terms of supply that is binding on both parties. So these are not transactions that are wished. For the private sector, we're not politicians, I must say. So we don't just make promises, we bind them to contracts. So if I'm going to a company and I'm saying, I'm going to give you a guaranteed supply, that means I will go the entire chain and ensure that I'm guaranteeing the same thing I'm giving to the customers, because there are penalties if I don't.
Yeah, of course.
Right? So when the man is willing to pay me a tariff that is reflective of the cost, by the way, Rolake, it's interesting that Nigerians don't know that self-generation is very expensive.
Absolutely. If you're using diesel for self-generation,
I don't want to go into the numbers because the jury is out.
But the reason they're doing that is because the grid is not reliable.
So here we are. It becomes a chicken and egg. What we're saying, therefore, is that it is in everybody's interest,
right,
that we all come together, all the sector players collaborate to ensure. So Agbara's project, for instance, is one of the most recent collaboration of its kind that we have seen. On there we have NDPAC on the generating end side of things. We have TCN sitting on the same table, assuring and bringing all it takes to wheel the power from the generation point to the point of the transmission station at the point of distribution. And then we are sitting on the table with the disco, in this case, the leading disco in Nigeria, Ekpo Disco. And we're sitting down to say, this is what we will do on your behalf as franchisees to make sure that the customer gets this. And at the end of the day, everybody, in terms of a business value, gets value. However, the most important thing, Nigerians get light.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well said. I like that sort of the way you painted the picture of that collaborative model. Mr. Ekpo, I have to ask you, recently there were two developments that happened. Is the sort of splitting of the transmission company into a systems operator and a service provider. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on what impact that is actually going to have. And then secondly, we saw the recent move, further moves and pioneers, Enugu, and I believe it was Ekiti State, sort of taking on regulatory responsibilities, devolved or decentralized regulatory responsibilities. How are states actually really going to truly handle regulation from a power sector perspective? I'd love to hear your thoughts very briefly on those two initiatives. Okay,
the first question about the ISO, TCN being split, it's fundamental to growth. So let's understand that there are now in Nigeria two. The electricity sector now has a dual structure. You've got on one hand what is now being called the national wholesale electricity market, which is all our big power plants connected to the national grid. That is one market. That's bulk. And take any analogy, any industrial, fast-moving consumer good business that you want to think about. You don't have an army of retailers without a wholesale supplier, right? So see your national grid as your provision, as a provider of bulk power. That is critical. Now, generating these significant amounts of energy that have to then be delivered to the various distribution companies at state level requires a generating entity and a transmission grid that is reliable and can deliver whatever is given to it to the buyer. Now, that's where your system operator comes in. We know the TCN. The TCN that we all know is the one that builds big towers, 330 kV lines, 132 kV lines across the country. That's the one that we all know. But the part of TCN that is really critical to keeping the lights on is the system operator, which is responsible. You might call it a traffic controller. Think of your, I know you're in the finance business, so think about your Nigeria interbank settlement system, ensuring that trades are settled in real time on a daily basis. So your bulk energy comes into the grid. It's not in containers, it's not in a lorry, it's not in packets, it's just plain energy. Someone has to say that this much energy goes over there and that much energy goes over there. And that someone who is sitting in the middle is the one that has to say also, to you who received, you have to pay so much to this person that delivered to you. That's a critical function. Up to this time today, part of the reason why our grid hasn't grown is that that function is being carried out manually. You need to go to the National Control Center at Osogbo and see what goes on there to understand part of the reason why we can't grow our grid much beyond 5,000 to 6,000 megawatts until we begin to automate, until we begin to let technology manage that process in real time. Yeah. No matter how much it will not grow. It's that simple. There's only so much that 5 or 6 gentlemen sitting down in a room looking at the frequency counter and holding a bunch of mobile phones connected to a bunch of people can do. Yeah. So that's all.
Thank you.
On the other side. Okay.
Very quickly, Mr. Ekpo, just very quickly, your comment on the Enugu-Ekiti development.
Yeah, so I was going to talk about that. Regulation is not of so many kinds, right? There isn't one type of regulation for one state or the other type of regulation for another state. And so you're not going to have regulation going on in any particular state different from the way it's been carried on in other places that work. You want to be transparent, you want to be consultative, you want to make sure that your rules are well thought through, and you want to make sure that enforcement, right, makes sense for everybody. And so what we have is the devolution to these states of a process that we all know how to go about it. And so it means that the challenge that we have is not necessarily about whether a state will be successful, but whether we can actually devolve the capacity, develop the capacity. And I think that's where the federal government needs to really try and be helpful to the states, because at one time or the other, there wasn't, let's say, at federal level, but it was developed. Now you now let responsibility go to states, and that means also developing that capacity in states. Otherwise, we will all see the failures that we don't want to see. And so what I would say is that you start small, like Enugu and Ekiti are trying to do.
Thank you, Mr. Ekpo. We're running out of time.
Small licenses. I'm so sorry about that. Okay,
no, but we got the gist of the matter, Mr. Nwoko. Very briefly, 2 seconds. Yeah. The future of decentralization from a power sector perspective in Nigeria.
We are very optimistic that this is the future is here. All parties must roll up their sleeves and get into the game. And you must be willing to put your skin in the game. Most financiers like you're good, the one you represent, have told us that categorically that with what we see, how you see you posture, we are willing to fund you. Okay. Right? We have other people like FGM Power Co. that have been set up that are supporting us through this process. Okay. So we feel that for Nigeria, the future is here, and we're ready to take it on.
Thank you very much. I've been speaking to Jude Nwoko of Millwater and, of course, Ekpo, the great former NERC commissioner on the power sector. Thanks for joining me on the show, gents. Well, that's all we have time for on Business Week this week. Let's continue the conversation on X. Do you have a lovely rest of the weekend? I'm Rolake Akekube-Filani. Thank you.